Okay, how long is this slot? This time slot? Got an hour and a half, so we're trying to survive to 11. And then at 11:30 we take a different session and we talk a bit about work. Is that correct? People's projects? Is that the idea? So I've been charged with talking about political ecology and policy, which is a topic about which I know nothing. So this should be rather brief. So what I want to do with this slot is talk a little bit about why I think political ecology makes for very good policy and why political ecology makes for very, very bad policy, and bad policy in a good way. So, and it's based on my argument from this article. Did everybody have a chance to read this chapter? So it's based on this argument that I'm making about why political ecology has survived. So who hasn't had a chance to read it? I sent it only a few days ago. So I'm going to summarize that argument here for you. That's what I'm going to do. And talk about it, but in terms of policy, which the chapter doesn't really address. It's implied, but doesn't address. So that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk my way through this argument. For those of you who've read it, this will just be a bit of a review maybe. And then after I've kind of talked about both the possibilities and the limits of political ecology for policy, I'll talk about what it's like working with non-governmental organizations who really do make policy, right? So that's how my interaction with policy has largely been through my cooperation with other organizations that make policy, often policy that I disagree with. So that, which has a lot to do with this first part. So I'll talk a little bit about theory in a sense, and then a little bit about experience. Is that good? And you guys can just catch up. So the thing that makes political ecology distinctive, and this is the last thing I will ever say about political ecology. If I'm ever asked to speak about political ecology again, I will turn down the opportunity. What makes it distinctive is that it operates on a dual track. That is, it produces grounded, material, historical arguments about why things are the way they are. It explains, yeah? It is a narrative of explanation, right? Why is there soil erosion? Well, there's soil erosion because farmers need to produce surplus because of a change in the tax regime and parastatal organizations working in Niger introducing peanuts for export to pay off debt and structural adjustment. Right? That's an explanation, right? You say why. It's a why explanation. There are some how explanations, but why explanations are best, right? So it's a material grounded argument. Why do we have these material outcomes? And the answer most often, sadly, is basically capitalism, right? Or occasionally it's like patriarchy, which is usually more convincing. But in either case, it is a grounded explanation. At the same time, political ecology is a narrative that confounds explanation. That is, it undermines explanation. It makes explanation harder. It muddies the water. Does that metaphor make sense? That translates reasonably well? Makes the water muddier, yeah? So political ecology works because it is constantly advancing explanations while constantly undermining the ability to explain. It accepts an ontology, a material ontology sometimes, that allows you to move forward while constantly making epistemological movements that make explanation more difficult. And that's the argument I've made, and I'm going to sort of review it again. But it seems to me the implications for policy are very similar for the implications for explanation. If your job is to explain, as a scientist, why things happen, that should clarify things, which should make policy making easier. If you are making epistemological and sort of historical scientific complications, that should make policy difficult. And political ecology does both, right? The explanation makes policy, you can make policy arguments, but that would be only half of your job. The other half of political ecology is to make policy more difficult, because policy is generally really bad, right? That is the idea. It undermines the ability for people to make shitty policy. Yeah? That's the question that came up yesterday about critical scientists somehow operate differently, right? Critical scientists are basically, their job is to make everybody else's job worse. To make it harder to advance whatever awful state project, capitalist project, patriarchal project. You're undermining people's ability. You're making it hard. You're making them stop and say, oh my God, what have I done? That's your project. But at the same, if you only did that, if that was all you did, that would be inadequate. I think what makes political ecology interesting is that it isn't just like literary criticism, because it's in a material world in which the stakes are very high and in which you are forced to always produce explanations. I think that's what political ecology is. And if you're doing something else, which is fine, sometimes you do other things. Sometimes you run a model or you do a life cycle assessment. You know, that's something you're doing. It's not political ecology. It's political ecology when you're doing both of those things. When you're advancing an explanation and you're undermining explanation. That's it. If you only did one, which is fine, it just wouldn't be political ecology, that's all. And that's okay. You don't have to do political ecology if you don't want to. You don't have to do political ecology all the time. You don't, right? You could be doing something else. In fact, I would recommend it. You know, I would save political ecology for special occasions and particular problems. Okay? So, let's just take you a little further through this. And the metaphor I use here, for those who haven't had a chance to see the article, I had some time sitting down reading ethnographic and folklore studies, and this double move that I just described here is captured in cultures across the world long before the time of Marx. And I would argue that it takes the form of the folkloric figure of trickster. Are you familiar with trickster? Renard the fox, Brer Rabbit, Anansi the spider. Every culture has a trickster figure. So we'll come back to that. And I would argue that political ecology is a trickster. So, and the trickster figure is a disruptive figure. So the Native American raven, the southwestern Indian coyote, there are Scandinavian versions of this, there are Chinese versions of this. Every culture, for whatever reason, has produced trickster. And trickster is a figure that generally is imitative. It generally takes the form of other figures. It is disruptive. It steals things. It's typically male, though not exclusively. He steals things. He undermines people. He fools children. I mean, he's a real asshole. But he is almost always productive in this relationship. So the classic, the Euro-mythopoetic version is actually the bringer of light, right? So Prometheus is actually a trickster figure, right? Prometheus is a thief. Yes? I mean, everybody's familiar with Prometheus? Yeah. Because this is a largely Western European context, right? But what is his, what's his legacy? What does he leave? He actually brings light. Trickster brings light in a lot of cultures, right? But always through some really nasty way, or he floods the entire landscape, but then, agriculture comes, these kinds of things, right? So I think that that's what's going on here, right? In political ecology, it's animated by the similar kind of deep structural Levi-Straussian Jungian figure. That's what I think today. That's my opinion. So let's see how this works in political ecology. Does everybody know what this is? This is a false color composite image for those of you who do not use remote sensing. So where you see red, you're seeing vegetative productivity, high levels of IR radiation, which means green. Red means plants. Blue means like open grassland and dirt. You following me? Does anybody know what this image is from, where it's from? And has no one seen this? You all get an F in political ecology. F, as in fail. Does anybody know where this is?
Well, it says there it's from Forbidden Leaf.
Yeah, but do you know where this is?
It's somewhere in Africa, but I can't remember.
Okay, so it's Guinea, so they worked in several West African countries, but has anybody read this book? Okay. Never read part of a book. Seriously. If you're going to sit down with a book, read an article then, Otherwise, read the whole damn book. All right. So, what are these? I'll tell you what these are. These are forest islands. That's what they're called. So as you can see, they're little circles of forest. Are you with me? And there's a little dot in there, it's like a donut. That's because at the middle is a village. And around it is a forest. And then out here, it's kind of open grassland and savanna scrub. Okay? So these forest islands have been this historic conundrum since the time of colonialism. When the French colonized West Africa, they came across these forest islands, and they could only reach one inevitable conclusion, which is, you must have read that part of the book.
Communities deforested the rest and
That's it. That the destructive, stupid native people came through and wiped out what used to be vast forest areas, leaving only behind these little bits of forest. So that's the conundrum. That's the policy. It is the policy of the colonial government to try to control people so they won't do that. It was the policy of the post-colonial governments, the state governments of West Africa, to do the same, to simply reproduce the state's bad policy. Why is it bad? It's bad because, and this is the first part of the movement, Fairhead and Leach go out, they take air photography from the 50s, they take remote sensing from the 70s. It was pretty forward thinking because this work was done in the early 90s actually. So for a kind of critical ethnographic scholar to work with somebody using remote sensing, actually I would call it visionary. I think this is one of the most important works in the history of the field. And what they do is they kind of do time series analysis. And what does it show? The forest islands aren't getting smaller, they're getting bigger, right? They're going like this because, and then you go on the ground and find out why. People plant trees, sometimes historically for defensive purposes related to warfare, sometimes it's gardening. But the point is, what people are doing on the land, the people who've been vilified, the people who have been the objects of state power, have actually been producing the forests that they've been accused of destroying. So that's a lot of forward-acting, materially grounded explanation, right? So the explanation in Fairhead and Leach is to explain first to ask the question whether forests are disappearing, and if they're not, why, right? Why? So it's a material, you go out, you interview people, you use remote sensing, you do a lot of science, you go collect numbers, you crunch those numbers, you show maps, you show pictures. It's a very kind of materialist, policy-oriented science, right? And you can see immediately that political ecology has a very grounded policy application, which is to say, maybe we should make policies that help people make more forests because they're doing it anyway, and stop punishing them and retract our state power. The thing about Fairhead and Leach, and I think like most political ecology, is it refuses to stop there. So that's one half of this story. The other half of the story is they ruthlessly go out and determine the roots of the discourse that says the forest is disappearing. Where did the idea that the forest is disappearing come from? How does it become an artifact of state power? Well, how does the policy, in other words, convey and contain power inside it, right? How is it constituted? Through what habits of governance? And how do they do this? This is still also somewhat material practice, but their second book, the other book, which is in the references to the paper, what they do is they go out country by country and they find out what the statistics are. So if you've got, this is how much forest cover we have, it's the years, 1992, and you say it's deforested, so you have forest cover numbers from 1950, so then they go and get the forest cover numbers from 1950, they say, where did they get those? Oh, those are from a book from 1930. Oh wait, where are those numbers coming from? Oh, those numbers are coming from a colonial archive from 1870, and so on and so on. So what we realize is that all numbers of forest, ultimately, all numbers of forest, even those produced through remote sensing, are basically intertextual, interreferential artifacts of discourse and text. It is turtles all the way down, as the saying goes. Anybody familiar with this?
We forgive.
Hmm?
Yes, the anthropologists we forgive to make this comparison with the turtles, no?
It's an old folk saying. It's an old, as you can see,
The levels of meaning over...
that meaning rests on meaning that rests on other meaning, right? And this is basic folk knowledge. This is known prior to Geertz, in a sense, enunciates it for a Western audience. But it's the origins of the universe, right? So the joke goes like this. A physicist gives a lecture on the origins of the universe to an audience, a public audience, and says, you know, back before the expansion of gases and things, everything was contained in a pinpoint, a singularity that exploded as a big bang and created the universe. And a lady comes up afterwards and says, young man, it was a brilliant lecture. I thought it was fantastic, but as we know, the universe rests on the back of a turtle. And the physicist says, aha, gotcha. What does the turtle sit on? And she says, young man, it is turtles all the way down. So my point about this is that what Fairhead and Leach are doing, right, is they're imitating science to make a policy argument in alliance with local people around bad policy, but at the same time, they're creating an argument that policy, numbers, the quantification of the forest, the practice of forestry, is based first interreferentially on borrowed text and is ultimately unstable. That is, to even make policy about forest is a practice of statecraft which is in a post-colonial relationship with subjects in the landscape. So they've made policy easier in the sense that if you want to advocate people's forest rights, it's easier once you've done the remote sensing. But they want to make policy harder by demonstrating the instability of the way we know about the forest in the first place. So it's structural and it's post-structural, right? But both. It's both. And having it both ways is precisely what animates the power of political ecology. Having it both ways. Now, having it both ways is bad science. Like, they haven't picked their epistemology. Oh, no. You know? They're contradicting themselves, right? You know, that tension, I think, is really, really important, and you need to be self-aware of it. I would describe it as an aporia. Yeah? That's something that is an inevitable condition of the colonial history of science, and just going to have to frickin' live with it. But if you're going to do this, you got to be doing both. So if you're advancing policy, right, you're also undermining the ability to make policy. And knowing when to do which is politics, in part, and about alliances and relationships with communities or whatever your project is, whoever you're trying to dethrone, you know? Okay, so it seems to me that that's a really generative, but also problematic thing to be doing if what you're trying to do is make policy. I would say a second thing about that, which is that I think this is how political ecology has evolved as and only as a relationship to other scientific practices. That's why there's no such thing as political ecology. Political ecology is merely a double move that responds to every other science, right? So forestry science, it is forestry science's other here, right? It's some kind of relative relationship. It is, or land change science, which I don't think is a familiar science in the European context, but in America, this is a very well-funded enterprise, right, to model land cover change scientifically using geographic information systems and technology, right? Land change science and political ecology seem to have so much in common, you know? They're both measuring the landscape, you know, they're both interested in change, they're both interested in economies. You know, and land change scientists are so frustrated. They keep trying to adopt political ecology, right? They keep trying to say, oh, you're right, you know, it is class, there is gender, we should put that in our model, right? And they do, you know, and as a result, land change science is better for it. It makes better policy. But it's infuriated by political ecology because political ecology never plays fair. It's always then, after it's done doing the land change science, the political ecologists come back and says, but of course, your model is predicated upon the assumptions of state power, which are embedded in the capitalist system. And they're like, God, stop it! Stop doing that. And that I think that's important, right? So political ecology doesn't exist on its own. Political ecology only exists in relationship to other sciences that produce the policy.
The noise.
What's that?
The noise
The noise?
of the silence of homogeneous perfect being.
Yes, yes. The noise. I like that. I never heard that. Where does that come from?
I don't know.
Is it Rancière? But the point here is that it's theory, it's the theoretical move, but it has this hugely practical thing because it animates a relationship. Send me the reference. So that I think, and so this happens over and over again. So it's not just land change science. So like environmental health is a field. It's an important field. There's a lot of smart people who do it, and I'm glad because people get sick and that sucks. So environmental health is a really important field, and I don't think it shouldn't exist. And it says, wow, I've been reading this political ecology stuff, and what I'm starting to understand, is that there's something about, a relationship between the public health officials, right, and these local people, which comes out of colonialism. I got to get that into my explanation. And so they bring in the political ecology. I want to add the political ecology. And then the political ecologist comes back and says, that's great, except you've actually just reproduced, right, the hegemony of expert power in the form of the public health official. Ah! Okay, so what I've seen is, for policy relevant science, is a constant effort to bring political ecology closer. And you get this in health, and so there's these books that come out, which you shouldn't read all of. It'd be like Land Change Science and Political Ecology. That was a book that came out like 2 years ago, right?
Turner, by Turner, the Turner guy?
By the Turner. This all comes out of we co-authored a paper on this. So, which nobody was happy with. Everybody hated that paper. That's
Ecology.
exactly. It's and. These are, I would call them, the analytical exceptions of political ecology are and political ecology. So it's always like land change science and political ecology, public health or environmental health and political ecology. The list goes on and on. There's the proliferating ands, like trying to embrace political ecology and improving as a result, but then constantly being undermined by this sort of cheating that goes on. That's what infuriates Pete Vida, who I know very well. Pete hates, so he was against political ecology was his classic article. This is what infuriates him more than anything else, is, always undermining the possibility of explanation, right? Always making political assumptions, when you could just be objective, right? So that would be my second thing that I would say about political ecology. It's also why political ecology is extremely useful, but it's also why political ecology in some ways doesn't exist on its own. That it can't make policy on its own. It can, but it can't. When it's making policy, it is appearing or behaving like something else. It's mimesis. Political ecology is acting like environmental health or land change science. That's its progressive, positive moment. It's mimetic, and it's precisely like the trickster. The trickster is always taking the form of some other thing in order to do what it needs to do. And this actually is a characteristic of this kind of folk tradition, that there's a reversal of roles, which is at the heart of almost all these stories, where the trickster either becomes or acts like the hero of the story, and then undermines that narrative. And this is because, I would argue, if I want to make a really universalist Jungian argument, following Harold Scheub, who was a professor of mine in college, he's a genius, spent his whole life just recording folk tales, right, throughout Africa. That's because this is a constant inevitable process. This is like life. This is politics, right? This is always happening. The creation and the destruction are ongoing. Political ecology is a creative, destructive enterprise. What does that mean for policy? Okay, 2 more examples that I used in the paper, and then I'll say a few things about what this means when you're working with an NGO. So these are 2 arguments that have been made. One is a chapter from a book on land change science and political ecology by Joel Wainwright and his colleagues from Korea. I've forgotten their names, so please forgive me. And the other is Julie Gutham's weighing in. Has anybody read this book? You should read this one all the way through. Okay, I'll summarize each of these arguments very briefly. What Wainwright et al. do here is they do a very Fairhead and Leach thing. They go out right now the Maya are being blamed for bad land management, Mayan people in Belize. So they go out and they do a bunch of quantification and remote sensing to show that, right, the Maya are not. That, you know, actually the forest is getting thicker or it's not degrading or whatever. They do some land change science. And the chapter's about to end, and then they say, but as we know from Heidegger, he goes always to Heidegger, this picture of the world is precisely the violence that predicates the relationship to the Maya. And therefore, the whole enterprise that I just conducted is actually worse for people than better. And in fact, it's not what's going to change the relationship between the state and the Maya anyway. I can proliferate all these stories all day long to help you make policy, but in fact, we have to overthrow the state, basically. That's how Joel concludes. This drove Billy Turner crazy, right? He had to read through all these chapters to write, we had to write a summary piece. I mean, it's just like, stop it. You were just about there. And then you did it again. But it can go the other way too, right? So Julie Gutland's book, Weighing In, this is about the obesity epidemic worldwide, but mostly in the United States. And what she dedicates her couple hundred pages to doing is showing how all of the statistics used to measure obesity, all of the explanations for why it happens, all of the ways in which it's treated by public health authorities are predicated on nonsense. Bad measurements, poor indices, indices that borrow assumptions from other indices that borrow assumptions from other indices, turtles all the way down. She spends the whole book turtling, except on page 83, where she says, you know, it could be endocrine disrupting chemicals. You know, there's this whole frontier field of environmental toxicology. So it has nothing to do with people's behavior. It has nothing to do with whether there are sidewalks in their neighborhood. Maybe it's just that we're all filled with awful chemicals. And that in the womb, we're getting exposed to these things, which then lead to an overall general increase in body mass in a global population. Well, that's infuriating. I mean, she spent the whole book essentially deconstructing our ability to explain obesity, and then she just comes in and says, oh, but this is my favorite theory, right? And because obviously something's happening, body mass index, whatever that is increasing, you know. Something's happening, there's a material world, it matters. Some people do get sick. So she just throws this out there. It's infuriating, she's been trickster all the way, and then suddenly she comes out as, right, hero. Yeah? Removes the mask, or puts it on one way or the other, right? All making policy difficult, and then make policy easier. Let's look at endocrine disruptors. Maybe there should be more funding for that. Genius, brilliant book, worth reading. And when there was an author meets the critics at the AAG on this book, all the reviewers, without consulting one another, said the same thing. You're cheating. You did this great job of taking everything apart, and then you like pick this, like you get 2 paragraphs on endocrine disruptors. You don't even know anything about environmental toxicology. You're talking out of school. But that's it. That frustration is what makes policy possible. As much as that frustration is what makes policy harder.
So the implications of this final interpretation that she chose is an interpretation that is extremely disruptive for the whole state policy, you know?
Yes, it is, right?
And it would require a rethinking of the state altogether.
Yes.
Because without these kind of substances, the whole power of...
Yes.
It's a very structural kind of...
Yes, except whose power then is ascended. And that is, in fact, a technocratic elite of environmental toxicologists, right? Who now suddenly, in a world constituted by the truthiness of that, are suddenly in a relationship to bodies that is, I think, actually possibly very problematic. But she doesn't care because she's not really trying to explain. It's just like a lawyer in court. What she's doing is she's bringing an alternative theory of the crime. So I don't know how European courts work, but in a US court, right, if you cannot constitute reason, if there's even a reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty, you got to find them innocent. So she just brings this on, in a sense, to just create enough doubt about all the other possible explanations so that you'll throw up your hands, right? I mean, it's sneaky, but it's still a grounded, science-based material argument, right? It's a material, it's a positive argument, even if it's advanced for a negative purpose. How and when to do this is politics, and you got to be careful. Or as I say about deconstruction, be careful where you point that thing. Yeah? Because it's a very powerful tool. So, that's what I think, I guess, about policy and political ecology. I would say about what that means for my own relationship to non-governmental organizations, that it is always fraught. That shouldn't be surprising to anybody, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to move the policy. They have the connections, they have the apparatus, they have the will to try to make policy. I'm working with them, we are allies, and it is always an unstable alliance, and it's always predicated on different kinds of commonalities or differences. I'll give you two examples. I worked with the Lokhi Pashu Palak Sanstan, which is an organization that protects or advances the rights of herders in northwest India, so especially the Raika, a particular caste of herders who historically herded camels. So that's one organization. And what do they want to do, right? They want to make sure herders have grazing rights. You know? Well, is that my project? Is my project to like get herders grazing rights? It's not. That's not my project. It's a middle to middle high caste community. There are a hell of a lot poorer people in India, right? But at the same time, their work to get those rights exposes and undermines a whole number of state projects around land and property in the Indian state, which are productive for advancing all kinds of other kinds of conversations. Does everybody understand? That my project, right, is this. Their project is that. They have a moment where they operate together fairly seamlessly. You know? So I can go out and write a report for them or whatever that says camel grazing is really not the problem in this forest. Because I just did some science, positive science, right? But I'm doing it to advance an argument that then would have to destabilize, precisely as you say. You make the positive argument because what you're doing is undermining a whole bunch of other questions about property regimes, like why aren't herders allowed in the forest and who says, right? What is reserved forest? What is the conservation mission of the Indian state? When and under what conditions are people allowed to be in the forest? I'm trying to make it harder for the Indian government to operate by making it easier for herders to graze, not the other way around. Right? The Sanstan's operating the other way around. They want to destabilize the state's property regime so that herders can graze. Okay? Right? And that's okay. So they're going to get some policy out of it, you know? But whatever. So there you go.
And then you further problematize it, and say, well, but then the herders are also undermining the rights of the
the Adivasis and somebody else. Yeah, exactly.
Were they fighting against the Forest Rights Act or something? So there you go. So trickster is always undermining somebody, but doing it through mimesis means you're always advancing somebody else. That's politics and policy. So if I knew what the right policy was, I'm sure I would go out and advocate it. I don't. These NGOs think they do. I want to help them. But then you got to pick your allies really carefully, right? So that's how a post-structuralist can work with NGOs. So that's the first example. The second example is a totally different NGO. It's really the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Center for Wildlife Studies, who I mentioned in my talk yesterday. WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, has been around. They're one of the oldest wildlife NGOs in existence. They run the Bronx Zoo. They've been around since, God, I don't know, Teddy Roosevelt, right? And you know, what's their project? It's pretty straightforward. There should be more tigers. That is their project. Or more frogs or more birds or whatever, right? That is their project. Am I really interested in whether or not there are more frogs? Yeah, I kind of am, right? I'm a nature guy. I like nature. But I think we're going through a great mass extinction. I think it sucks. I think the Wildlife Conservation Society is doing some interesting things to make that not happen. I want to work with them. And they've got this expertise. I mean, we always talk about it like, well, we'll lend our expertise to the NGO, right? But what you're really doing is you're stealing their authority and their expertise for whatever project you're advancing. And that alliance is not necessarily destructive. It can be very productive. It's an alliance where a lot of things can happen. If you can show that there are more frogs,
where there's better working conditions. I mean, that has a possible political leverage that is really interesting. And everybody wins. WCS wins, they get more frogs, somebody else wins, right? So you're advancing in a positive way, you're making these arguments. But at the end of the day, right, for me, in this case, workers are more important than frogs. For me, in this case, for whatever reason, for whatever arbitrary reason of my own ego power, right? Right? So, and because I'm just curious, because I'm really just curious what's going on. So you ally with these folks, and it's a good relationship, it's a productive relationship, but it's necessarily fraught because they are using you to get something done, and you are using them to get something done. And that is my model of how things happen. It's a little different than what somebody said yesterday, and it will be different than from me, so you talk to tomorrow. Everybody does their work differently and for different reasons. But I think if I'm right about political ecology, then this is one of the few ways I would suggest to have a productive relationship as a researcher in a world where there are multiple projects and you can't support all of them, right? Ethically. Is that, you want to talk about that? Because I'm done. Is that too short? No, so let's talk about that. Anybody's experience of this similar or dissimilar? You've all worked in the world.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, I was thinking about this idea of using deconstruction selectively and very carefully, but what about using strategic essentialism selectively? Like, for example, if you're engaged in an indigenous movement and so on, you know that there are problems in the way that in the aims of that movement or in the way it works. But there are moments that, for me, I wonder whether it makes sense to gloss over those problems in order to, I mean, that's scientifically problematic, but it does have, it is also an important choice when you
It's a very
want to
important
make
choice, yeah.
policy relevant or politically relevant, rather, interventions.
Yeah, there's a whole literature on this. and smarter people than me have written on both sides of this question. You think it's a good, you would accept that strategically as acceptable. I'm not saying whether I would or not, but you would.
It's a dilemma for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dilemma for me.
Yeah, it's a dilemma.
Yeah.
The person who talked about strategic essentialism is Spivak, because she was doing both the critical deconstructive work and work in the field. So it's not like you reject that, because you are a critical theorist, you realize that sometimes these kind of options on the ground are necessary in everyday life. But you also realize that you don't stop there, like you say. You move forward. You do these strategic temporary alliances so that you can move forward. They are necessary, but you understand that they are not the final goal to stop at some kind of essentialism that helps your cause.
Oh, then I agree with Spivak. Awesome, because she is much smarter than I am. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's congruent with what I'm working through in any case. So I guess the answer is yes, but. Right?
Well, I have a different point of view here, actually.
Please.
It's because we're putting ourselves like in the center of everything of the world of knowledge. And there is the Indian movement there, then there is this Bastards capitalist here, and we're bridging everything. And the experience that I have, I work a lot with Indians in that. And especially I had one very interesting interview last week, one of the leaders of the Brazilian Indian movement in the 80s. And his perception is how he's seeing us as possible allies, and bridging alliance, making different alliances. So we'll be doing something that they cannot do it, they don't want to do it, Same thing with journalists and angels, just like what we're explaining, like, well, there is WCS, that they have many problems. I have the same experience with Greenpeace, in fact. But they do stuff that we know that it's some bullshit, but in the other sense it's important. And I think India will do the same with us. I mean, they are also using, in this capacity of political ecology, to make other dialogues, and somehow trying to pressure some I don't know, some institutions to make some policies, but also have a capacity to dialogue with the press, with the other signs. So we can also be seeing that in another sense, that how this movement will look at you there, you know, and how you can contribute in this bridging thing. Once we're not this science that is so, you know, well defined, and we can talk about some other ones, they also can see us as a political ally in this sense, you know. And I think this is a very interesting point, as you put in political ecology, you know, how we can find ourselves in this movable world of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's congruent. The only exception I would take, ontologically, is to the word center. You began with the word center, that you're the center of things. So, and your point was to decenter that and say they're using you as well. Yeah, there's no center to this process at all, right? It's a total, like it doesn't even have any edges. Other thoughts about this? I don't have any other. This, like I said, I'm never talking about political ecology again. Is there somebody in the back?
Can you speak louder?
Come closer.
I totally agree with this idea that we have different purposes and different projects, and this has to be recognized, otherwise it's a fraud, even bigger than we think. I think there is a mutual use of these purposes, but in this relationship, I think we should recognize that scholars are taking the part of the lion.
Yeah.
We should not idealize the idea of going native, because we really never go native. But if we don't, the quality of our research is not as good as it is. I would be if we don't. So I don't think fully acknowledge this usually when we report our research, and we report as us. And this is so unfair. I think any outcome of research that comes from this alliance should be fully recognized as a core production. And I don't know to what extent this is done. Really.
Yeah, I think that's really compelling. I think that's right. But you've got two different metaphors in what you said. One was acknowledging that this is an extractive relationship, right? That you're taking the lion's share. You are taking something. It's theft, or it's borrowing, depending on whether it's a capitalized or non-capitalized relationship. But you're taking something, and then you're publishing it, or you're advancing your project, or whatever it is. That's coming out of them. That's coming out of their labor. It's coming out of their knowledge. And then there's also this thing, you use the word cooperate at the end. At the end, you use cooperate. So it's either theft or cooperation, but I think the thing that's less often acknowledged is the theft part. And more often we say we're cooperating, when in fact, you know, there's a lot of taking that goes on. I think that's right.
I think as time goes on, organizations get more and more aware of this. And sadly, maybe they are also getting more cynical on this. So this mutual use starts to be more strategic, and also I think less loses part of the original intent.
Yes.
And then we are useful and our part is useful as long as we open strands for them to do what they really want to do is getting in contact with certain levels of politics that they cannot reach usually by themselves. But as the influence of science maybe is getting things in this area, maybe we are less useful.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, I think accessing researchers so that you can access power is probably on the wane. You're getting less powerful. But there's other utility for those alliances, and you wouldn't have them if they didn't see something in it for them. So to even have a relationship, this is how the nature of all relationships. So yeah, I think that's a really powerful observation. Why people are allying with you is going to vary enormously by the community and their project too. I mean, I don't think my relationship to the NGO that I'm working with now is about accessing. Well, I guess it is about producing legitimacy, even published papers. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I just have to think it through. Yeah. Thank you. Where are you coming from? Okay. So you are ICTA. I'm trying to get the lay of the land because we got entitled. By the way, in English, that's just a terrible word.
We know. We are the entitled.
You're the entitled. It's a sense of entitlement. It's everything that's like bad. It's everything you're trying to avoid as a. Yeah, go ahead. Yes?
It's trickster. That nobody is
Trickster, yeah.
Nobody's entitled, but here you guys are.
The fish are recognized by the American.
Anyway, all right. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if I can, let's see if I can try to express this properly. I just want to focus on what you said, that, you know, the starting point of your research somehow, that's the way I understand it at least, is to say, well, is this my project? Do I politically want to engage in supporting this group and what they're looking for?
I wouldn't say that's my starting point.
One starting point.
It's a question that has to be asked early.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, early on.
Yeah.
Personally, I have some, not problems with that, but like, I haven't done that starting my research many times. I haven't done it. But I have ended up finding injustice happening, for example, in processes. I also work with decision-making processes. And sometimes those injustices do not affect the weak group. I cannot identify the weak group affected by this injustice, but I still see some sort of injustice there happening. So I struggle to say what is politically relevant in my results and recommendations, but still I see power differentials happening, power in influencing this injustice going on. And well, my sort of, well, this is a reflection, no? I'm not sure what the question could be perhaps, you know, is this not political ecology then? Is it something else? When you cannot say, you know, that's, when you cannot provide an alternative explanation that would benefit some sort of a group or some sort of a weak group, you know, out of that explanation.
Well, if you are, even if you're not advancing a particular group, if your explanation, it's an excellent observation. If the positive moment, if we just crudely identify these as positive and negative moments, which is itself highly problematic, but that you're making an argument that might be policy relevant, to the degree you're doing that, it's to solve something that you view as less good. Yeah. So yeah, it's not. That doesn't mean you're picking a side. You know, you may just be trying to improve the justness, right, of a particular deliberative process.
Yeah. But it's difficult when you end up saying, you know, these middle-class farmers somewhere in the south of Catalonia are being treated unfairly. So people will go like, so what? You know, they're losing some money as well. There's so many people around.
Yeah, yeah. So it isn't always about picking sides,
Yeah.
but you're still at some point making an argument that there's something wrong about the process.
Yeah.
It's a little Rawlsian.
Yeah,
Rawls,
that's
do people
the
know
problem.
Rawls? You know, it's a little Rawlsian. Like, you know, if we could just get the process better, it'd be more just.
Yeah,
But I don't think that's wrong. Like that's like.
But it can also be seen as a problem in the way power relations are done. So the way power relations are practiced, it's not just, they are very visible when there is some victim.
yeah.
And that's why in political ecology you have that's why I like, you have to have a victim. The worker, the farmer, the poor, you have to have a victim. But when you don't, then when the victim doesn't sound like a victim in this vocabulary that we have, is not okay. I don't think that's a Rawlsian problem. It's a problem of how you look at power. And power relations in general are unequal. The inequality of power relations can happen even among us. So you have an injustice and a political ecology problem. It's not about a particular group, marginalized group, but if power relations are unequal, you have to address them, no matter where they happen.
Right.
So the materialized relations, I agree with that. Like that's the problem, that it seemed like Rawlsian, and I'm getting very frustrated by that because that's not my, you know, my outlet, my political outlet.
Well, let me put it this way, because I think that's right. That resonates with me. My point here is about alliances with organizations, and organizations have agendas that may be victim-driven. right? And when you have that relationship with them, they are going to be advocating for the victim. And to the degree that you're not, or to the degree you are, to the degree you're not, right? And that what you're really trying to do is make things more difficult,
Yeah.
right?
I want to talk about the victim. For example, in the Transylvanian case, the victim was the Roshian. But when you go into the ground, the Roshian themselves don't know how to relate among themselves as one homogeneous victim group. And when Soros came, the foundation, the big Soros Foundation, they tried to help also the victim. But the victim didn't know how to look at this. Because some parts of the victim group thought that Soros' intervention might actually help their cause. Some parts, no. So the victim, there is no victim. You start to see the conflict on the ground because the victim thinks differently about itself and about the future imagination that they can have. Isn't that political ecology?
Sure, of course it is.
Exactly.
But
So
my question for you is this, merely this. What would you consider a different, what would a different outcome, what would a different condition look like?
For whom?
For people living in this context? Is there a normatively, what's a normatively better condition in your imagination?
They had to develop it. It was no Soros, no research.
Right, but,
so
you're-
They renegotiate what the normative would be according to how they see their own power relations within the community. So they were fighting. For years they were fighting. Oh, you are a traitor. You're not a real community member. Who is the traitor? Who is the enemy? Who is the real community? And so they were fighting, and then they were strategizing together. They were fighting together. So in the end, it was a process. It's not even finished.
That's
Yeah,
why I'm talking about processes normatively, because you're saying, look, you need to colonize the processes democratically, for example, to get there. And I don't see this as wrong.
I don't say it's wrong. Let me take back my Rawlsian statement. It's sort of the way you phrase it. But it's not a question. I agree. So that is, of course, that's political ecology. My observation about that is merely the question, a practical question of where I'm being forced to make this argument because I've been asked to talk about policy. So my question is, what is the policy in all of that? Not just obviously I feel the politics. I definitely get the power. What is the policy? And to the degree that you are interested in a policy, and you don't have to be, you could just not be interested in policy, which is, I think, totally defensible, by the way. But to the degree that you are, or more to the point, to the degree that you are in a relationship with people who are engaging with a policy, what is your relationship to that? And I guess that is common to both the victim problem and a process problem, right? That you have a relationship, and that's what you're prodding. Both positive. I keep using positive and negative. It's not a very good metaphor, but you see what I mean. Those two different moves. So a different kind of process is an outcome. Of course, But this is exactly my point. When you're working with people who have victims, not everybody does, but if you're working with an organization that has victims and they're advocating for victims, that's very common. You're often not interested in those victims. You're much more interested in the process. You're much more interested in power in the first place. That's very typical, I think, of political ecology, right? And I think there's a certain kind of advocacy thing that happens, but I think much more often that's the populating the world with turtles is that. I mean, you're trying to make it harder for simple kinds of models or outcomes to occur, so that people can make some space for people to join in some kind of process. Otherwise, why are you there? Right? I mean, you are trying to catalyze something, or at least observe it in a way that would make other people's catalyzing it easier, or something. Right? Why write? Why produce narratives? And I guess that's what I'd say. Producing narratives is different than producing policy.
I wanted to maybe so that we don't get the discussion in the box of policy. We can think of how useful political ecology can and should be. We can frame it as that, no?
Yeah, that's sort of actually.
Yes, yeah.
That's sort of where I wanted to start.
What
Yeah.
are the implications of this? And I was thinking, what are the implications of this for the way we organize society, for policy also, for ourselves? we had an argument today about, because I always think I'm right. And sometimes we act as we are always right. And policy is framed in a way that there's one policy that is right. And there's an homogenizing, totalizing way of organizing policy, organizing society, organizing politics. And so I'm guessing that, I mean, what this is saying is much deeper than.
Oh yeah, I hope so.
It's really,
I really hope so.
No, it's something about, I mean, I want to hear your thoughts on this. If it's, what we're saying is we should really be much more careful in everything we do and how we behave ourselves. When we do a policy, do it as a tool, as an adaptive craft, as an experiment, which some policy scholars have talked about it in that way. But also the way we organize our movement, a cooperative or whatever, an NGO, just to be more open to change, to constantly learning. I guess this is the point, that there's always something that is wrong on what we do, right? And there's always something that is right, but there's a little bit always that has to be criticized. So my professor was saying, you know, the point is not to find a solution, but to do constant diagnosis. She called it diagnosis. She was obsessed with this kind of word, but it's
I like
about
diagnosis.
constantly critically evaluating everything that we do, so we can keep learning and improve. I don't know.
Oh, I would hate to argue against that. I mean, yes. So the answer is yes. Having said that, when you are in a relationship with people who have particular visions of the world that they're advancing, and this, I guess really this is about relationships. I guess the original paper that you read is actually not about a relationship with an NGO or with a project or with a victim. It's actually about a relationship with other scientists. So for me, it's the relationship with other scientists, with other intellectuals, with other thinker workers that plagues me and fascinates me, right? And those relationships and alliances are fraught and cooperative and normative and demand constant self-scrutiny, right? But you don't want to not have them. I mean, I don't want to not have a relationship with conservation biologists. Conservation biology, yeah, I have a project. I want to see a different kind of conservation biology. Wouldn't like a different kind of conservation biology be exciting? Because the one we got now is really sucks. So yeah, you know, those are those relationships. I then grafted that argument into other politics that are non-intellectual, right? That have to do with, say, and for example, NGOs, or more loosely, with a condition or process on the ground that's occurring where there are interventions that you may or may not be participating in. I mean, Soros is making an intervention. You want to be present in those. In the same way you want to be present in conservation biology. You don't want to be absent. Because if you stay home, you will be the only one staying home. You know, the US military will be there. McDonald's will be there. Soros will be there. And if you are the only one staying home, then you know, like the most revolutionary thing you can do is sleep. So what I mean by that is, yeah, and then so you do it. And the only way to do it then is to do it the way you described, right? Whatever you're trying to you know, catalyze or, yeah, so don't, you know. And when you don't stay home, then all this trouble starts. The minute you go out the door, all the trouble starts, right? There's a phobic condition, actually, right? What is it? Which is the phobic condition where I can't go outside?
Agoraphobia.
Yeah, agoraphobia, which I think actually is a diagnostic condition of the post-colonial scholar and the critical scholar and the feminist scholar. I think it's, and that if you're not doing diagnosis, some kind of autotherapeutic practice, you won't go outside. Conservation biologists don't go outside. I mean, they're out in the park counting frogs, but they've never gone outside the park. They're agoraphobic. So maybe one of the catalytic roles is to be a partner in therapy. I'm just thinking about this. Don't anybody quote me on this. But if we know that the problem with conservation biology is that, and this is my project, it's not yours, I get it, but there may be some similarity, your project, maybe not, okay? I'm doing a little work on myself here. If my project is that conservation biology has done violence to people and that it configures relationships of power that tend to reproduce state authority when has bad outcomes. I mean, something's normatively wrong. Something's wrong, I'm not quite sure what it is. And conservation biology is helping make it happen. What I need them to do is to get out of the park. So that is an autotherapeutic relationship to a mutual agoraphobic condition. You know? And that may be true like with working with Greenpeace, or it might be true about, you know, just working in a Southern Spanish context, right? So I see the most fecund metaphor for me right now is therapy. It is. It might not be psychotherapy. I'm just too stupid to know what it is, right? But I think there's something about this. What therapy tells us, so far as I know, is that it never ends. Any good therapist would tell you that it never ends. Something constantly wrong. It's everything you said, right? But you don't want to be so auto-centered, right, that suddenly you're in the center, right? Which you're not. You know you're not in the center. And reminding yourself of that is autotherapeutic, so that you can go outside.
Perhaps you can do collective hikes or something as well, you know.
I love that.
Like embody.
I love that.
Try to get through these dilemmas and contradictions through your body as well, and through collectively linking to those people with whom you need the support and the therapy.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Some sort of embodying this.
I think that's totally right. So in the case of the frog work, right, that actually is what's going on. So the biologists and the economists and the whatever I am are actually in physical motion through the landscape, you know, interacting with people, and then doing critique sessions when we get home of ourselves, right? You were asking leading questions. No, you didn't hear her. You weren't listening to her. I mean, that's a very productive interaction. But again, that specifically for my project, right? It's to cure myself, right, of patriarchy or whatever. But more to the point, that's not enough, right? It is about curing conservation biology.
Are
we done? When are we done? Okay, let's go.
And if the frog is sacred, and is a human, like the campo in the Amazon, for example, you know, they have some special use. And I would like
That's
to
a good
ask
point.
about this, how do you incorporate, as you come from anthropology as well, these other ontologies, cosmographies, cosmologies, which this is something that the ones who were in Chile were discussing that with genes, which is a very important subject when you are dealing with other words. I don't know if that you mean, and how do you see this connection in political ecology incorporating?
Yeah, I think it's just a great observation, right? You're operating in diverse ontological spaces, different cosmologies all the time. My observation about that is merely that it's not exclusive to indigenous communities, right? So the differenceness, the ontological differenceness is ubiquitous. And so you have a real problem taking them seriously, taking every ordered universe seriously on its own terms in a world of one, total, constant, ongoing differentness, and of a political space in which that difference becomes autocratic or dangerous or violent. So I don't know what to say about that. I would say that what I learned about in anthropology, about cosmology, I've tried to apply to white middle-class people in America. That's what I would say, right? To be symmetrical in my taking seriously the worlds of others. And it can be really it just can be an interesting exercise. So the power and taxonomy has been actually a research topic of mine. Like, what are the ontological names of things? And what things are considered the same, or what things are considered different by different people? And this could be very simple, like palm trees are not considered trees by some people, and they're considered trees by others, right? But it can be something much more complicated, like whether or not, the frog is a person, right? So, but both of those really are the same order of problem. They seem to me to be ontological problems. I don't have anything to say about it, except that it's really interesting and dangerous. Because you want to embrace and take seriously those cosmologies and how they animate relationships. But like, it's turtles all the way down. Because the more you look for them, the more difference you'll find. So this is Badiou's point. I think this is so great because people have theory. Badiou, right, his argument actually is that everything is different. That everything is absolutely different. And that almost all politics is set theory. So he uses a complex mathematics, right, of how you make sets out of things that are different, because everything's different. And that's the problem with cosmological kinds of difference.
So you can steal it and then kind of criticize it, but use it.
Yeah, but you got to be careful. Like, this is sacred stuff to people. I mean, you know, I'm not going to criticize somebody who takes a frog. Well, let's put it this way: I'm not going to criticize a Kayapo who thinks a frog is sacred, but my upper middle class neighbor, you know, like doing all kinds of politics, like to maintain the neighborhood in a particular way, and they think some tree is sacred. I'm like pish posh, right? You know,
Like
bourgeois white privilege. So it's very so. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. But the Kayapo have a particular historic constitution through a post-colonial process, which is different than my neighbor, and I believe that.
But Paul, can I ask you something in relation to this? When we're looking at health and different systems of understanding the body, and you have like people thinking this kind of thing will cure them and this not, and you're as a Western scientist trained in, you know, here, you are called to give a policy recommendation on what is your proposal, you know, to prevent this or that disease. And you have your own biases, but at the same time you want to respect and really try to bring in the traditional or cultural beliefs of people. So I find that as a huge tension. Like, I find that so difficult to deal with. And I don't know if you have thought about it or encountered it and how you go about it.
I don't have an answer for you. I did have a PhD student working on HIV in South Africa, and I would just invert it this way. What they were doing at the time, the South African government, is that they were taking native healers and they were bringing them into hospitals and parking them in a special room so that they could just get people to come to the hospital. I mean, it was so cynical, and it was such a total failure that she was in a position, right, to say that what you've done is a cosmological violence, and that there's a policy recommendation that comes out of that, which is don't do that, right? So, so that's the negative. I mean, that's the undermining argument. But at the same time, right, she's not advocating that people don't see a doctor for medication about HIV. She's not advocating the opposite. She's merely undermining a relationship that is not going to even achieve its own aim. So I guess I don't have an answer, right? Except that I think that this process is the only one available to me. That maybe there's another one available to you, which is you have to advance an argument that you know you're going to have to undermine later or at the same time. You're going to have to. You will have to say something. Or what are you doing? Why are you producing text unless it's entirely autotherapeutic? Right? You are producing text to have an effect of some kind. And those texts are violent, and you're going to have to undermine it. You're going to have to say, but of course, this isn't exactly how the world works. This is, right? This is the only process available to me yet for that kind of problem. I don't know, what are you doing? What are you going to do?
Yeah, I'm trying to combine political ecology with critical microanthropology, and I'm trying to, I've been looking into health education processes and trying to see how, you know, how this could be somehow a process which might or might not change the way people think about their bodies, but perhaps it will make them more empowered to take decisions, or will encourage them to take it to their own hands and rather than, do practices that at the end of the day hurt the health as well.
That sounds right. I think that's, how does that sound to you guys? I mean, these process answers are important and they're good. Right. But then somebody's going to ask you to advocate some particular configuration even of a process. And even then, you're still going to have to make some kind of argument that this process is different than the other process in some way or another. I mean, you will still have to make that positive argument. You were going to say?
Yeah, just as a policy, if it becomes a policy, then it becomes static in some element. I mean, I think the question, this is like a doubt that I always have.
Like when people ask me
my
what,
problem with policy,
so
Yeah.
is it when you start to formulate it in a language that becomes institutionalized, it becomes static and it becomes like a, because also it's an issue of implementation and trying to operationalize something that's complex, and then, yeah. So I think, this is, I mean, for me, this is a big question and a doubt, and I don't like policy, because I have this association with it as something that's, I mean, I think there can be progressive policy, but it's so difficult to actually see something that looks that way.
I don't know. I mean, there's like, people used to dump lead on people, and like, now we have a rule that sometimes is enforced where they don't dump as much lead, and that's better. So, but I'm not dismissing this. I think everything we've said here bolsters your point, more than it bolsters the point about lead. Right? What we've all agreed on is you're right. And then I'm like, but lead. So.
No, this is the issue that's so
I know.
difficult, because it is not saying it's not useful.
Right.
But then when you're trying to operationalize this complex, I think
Right.
that's what political ecology does, it disrupts this.
Right.
process.
But
Then how do we
it
actually
can't
do
just
something?
be
It can't just
disruptive.
be disruptive.
You've got to advance. The only thing that makes the disruption legitimate is that it wears the mask of practice that can resolve problems. That is why, yeah, right. That's why you do that instead of not that.
Yeah.
So about the lead, right? It's the same thing as with the WCS or with the RICA. You want lead, somebody wants lead out. You think it's probably a good idea. But what you're really after is the fact that the lead's there because of racism, structural racism in America. And your target is structural racism and the process of relations that produce that. That may be your target, but I think it's a good target, right? Because I think structural racism sucks. So lead becomes a vehicle, a positive vehicle to do an undermining relationship, even though lead is only ever part of the problem, and then it ossifies into a policy that doesn't solve structural racism, it only solves lead, and then you get upset with yourself for having reified and perpetuated a system that's destructive, and then you go out and you undermine it. I don't know, I got anything better.
I think in the end is, I see many times you go back to your position, to your bias, if you want, and I think this honesty that, okay, where is it that you want to go? As a researcher, okay? And you have to have the honesty, okay, what I'm really interested, if I show these inequalities, these injustices, what I'm really interested to say is that we have unequal relations in the worker, in the giving classes, let's say, yeah? So you have this honesty, this is my bottom line, this is where I want to go.
Right now, this me,
Right now.
this time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, I contextualize this problem of racism, and I put it in a broader framework so that people see that broader framework. This doesn't mean that I cannot recommend specific solutions, but the fact that I always say that these solutions are in a broader context of injustice, or it's your target as a researcher, where you look at the broader picture. But I would say that even this broader picture, you'll have to always question, because somebody else might say, actually the broader picture is this one, not just
That's
this
right. Oh, that's right.
There's
in
no
a
one
sense.
brother.
So
No, that's right. It sits on top of something else, or under something else.
Yeah.
So the 1990s were a good decade. We learned something from 1990s. Congratulations. So, Frank, I mean, you know what I mean? That's actually, don't forget the 1990s. It was not that awful a decade. So I would add one last thing before we go, which is a slightly different point, which is that what the policymakers are looking for is probably what they already know.
But what's good for them is what they don't know. And what's good as a researcher as opposed to being a novelist, and they're different. Being a novelist is probably a better thing to do, probably changes more lives. But if you're interested in surprise, I mean, most of the best novelists that I've spoken to actually don't know how the novel is going to end. The characters surprise them, right? But I do think that as researchers, like, surprise is one of my favorite things. So to be able to be surprised by an outcome or an interaction with a person or a frog is, I think, our rare opportunity. Like, this is something you get to do that not everybody gets surprised. I guess that is a universal experience, but you actually you're paid to go get surprised. So I think that's different. And I think that the pursuit of policy as a grail-like, ever-receding object, if it lures you to be surprised, and then to spring surprises on decision makers or people in power, I think that's good. So I would just be always open to be surprised, you know? I guess I know that's such a stupid thing to say, but like, it's such an obvious thing to say. Well, it's not that obvious. So if you're not being surprised in your work, like, you're either doing it wrong or you're doing the wrong work. You know, you should be doing something else.
But sorry, think about this comment about also your policy briefs. I think it's a bit ridiculous that I bring it down into that, but think about this, because we had this discussion yesterday, and think that perhaps the policymaker as well would like to be surprised by what you suggest. Or the person who reads the policy brief, be it a policymaker or a policy stakeholder, whatever they may be, the audience would be interested to be surprised as well. No?
I think, well, it's the other thing about narration. You may not be surprised. I mean, I like to be surprised, but let's say you don't get surprised. You can narrate. Remember, this is a text business. Like, ultimately what you're doing is producing text. Movies or books or radio dramas or videos or whatever it is, right? That's, at the end of the day, whether it's a policy document or otherwise, if it's narrated so that it produces surprise, I think it's a better document than if you already know, if the reader already knows the end before they start.
But you have to be careful what the surprise is, because you don't want to say chemicals make people fat, and that's your surprise in a policy paper. That's what you say.
But that's what Julie did.
It depends on who was surprised by that. But if the
I didn't find it very
person who
surprising.
didn't want to be surprised was surprised. This is the whole. It's not surprising for you, but maybe for those who are using those chemicals, was like, oh, oops, this is a surprise. I was not ready for this.
Right, and let me be clear, coming back to this technique, the reason in the Guthman case that she pulls that surprise is to make the other arguments, which are really relationships, harder to maintain. So this is not separate from what I've said, or what we've said together. It's something else, but it's an additional point that, yeah, I think you should be both prepared to be surprised and prepared to produce surprise. But that's part of this. That is what tricksters do. Surprise. You know? I think that's part of their narrative power.
To give an example of surprise, you saw the policy brief we made from Clico, no? You saw that in detail or not? From our Clico project, the climate change. So basically, I mean, we weren't very much surprised. We already knew before the project started with Christos, no, that climate change does not lead automatically to war and violent conflict, no? So we knew it. But the discourse in the European Union at the time was precisely that. No? We want, and that's why they gave us money, because we want you to study how climate change is going to increase violent conflict in the Mediterranean through water. No?
Nice.
So we did this research, and then we came out with a surprising policy conclusion. No, climate change is not going to increase violent conflict and war in the Mediterranean. There's no evidence for that. On the contrary, we say climate change can be a violence to people directly, you know, through damages, through floods, through droughts, etc. So that was. So you can of course be cynical and say the whole thing is very trivial. We already know from the literature 30 years ago from Michael Watts. You know what I mean? That this is not the case, etc. So you weren't surprised. Where is the surprise? But you know, when you present it in the European Union, we presented it as a surprise. You know, and in a way, it was surprise given the dominant discourse.
Nice.
On the other hand, they didn't accept it also, you know, like, when you say,
Well, that's why I don't write policy documents.
Yes, when you say that, and you say, okay, yes, right, but we need to take care and map how climate change is going to increase violence in the Mediterranean. Like, we don't have so much effect.
No, right. I mean, a little humility is always appropriate, right? But I do think that you can structure your arguments keeping in mind that your role is trickster, so that you're springing them on them. I think that's, you know, that's how I narrated our little story about labor yesterday. In a certain sense, I was a little surprised. Obviously, if I'd seen it coming, it would have appeared in our grant proposal, but it didn't. So clearly, I'm an idiot, and I was actually surprised. But I also like it's a theater of surprise, right? Because the real surprise is on the conservation biologists. So you have to narrate the story, right? Because you know, I'm you know, a materialist. Labor matters. I'm not going to be that surprised, even when it comes to frogs. But for conservation biologists, that's like, whoa, surprise. But it has to be narrated in a positive way. It has to be narrated as a voyage of discovery. It has to be narrated, not necessarily as positivism, but as a narrative, a positive narrative of what is happening. Otherwise, you can't achieve surprise, because you're saying what is. When you thought it was, it's really this. And that project may be to undermine something else, right? But that's in your narration. That's in the way that talk was structured. That talk was structured to do that. It's playwriting. It's theater. So I would keep that in mind as you write your text as well.
I think perhaps it's not even so much of undermining the way of thinking of, let's say, other people, but it's more of maybe pushing to other people to see the different way of imagining the effects of that. Because sometimes we think what we think because we cannot imagine something else, you know? So we have to be right, because we have to say, oh, this, the violence, oh, no, we are right. The violence will be produced by climate change because we cannot see something else, actually. We are just obsessed with this fear that we have of the violence. So we think we are right because this is the only thing we can see, and we forget to look at the violence that is already happening because we are obsessed with that particular. Of course, states are obsessed with these wars, no?
That shouldn't be surprising.
Yeah. No, that's not surprising, but they are in the paradigm because they cannot imagine something else.
But also, sorry to answer Jonas's question, I think also it depends how you structure it and how you present it, as you were saying. For example, if you go to a policymaker, you say, well, the policymaker wouldn't want to hear that, no? They don't want to listen about it. But it really depends. If you tell them, look, what you know about obesity is this, this, and that, and what I'm telling you now is this other thing, okay? So you're not being so controversial necessarily if you structure it in this way. You're not putting them off to read that if you structure it in this way as new knowledge or as something different. And of course, perhaps it's not going, as Yorgos said, you know, they didn't say it's the mindset of the European Union. But some people have read that, and some people in policy may think it twice. Not all of them. May think it twice when they participate in some sort of a group event to make this argument again and again. Some people, so this is also how you need to think about your impact. It's not obviously the impact that's going to change the world tomorrow, but impacts, you know, happen slowly as well, and they happen through shifts, through small shifts. And for me, if someone goes in a meeting to make decisions or to discuss, for example, European security and stuff like that, and they listen to this argument again and again and say, but you know what, we've heard this as this alternative explanation. This thing, getting into the discussion, has some importance. And it depends how you present it for those people to pick it up and register it, I think.
Yeah, but that alternative explanation cannot just be one paragraph for me, that's what I mean.
Well, and I think our critique of Julie's book was actually that her storytelling could have been a little better.
Yeah.
So that's a critique of writing and storytelling. So that's just something to keep, if you're a trickster, you better be good at it and be careful where you point that thing. Let's take a break.